Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I'm here to do another Friday Reads, and I have to say that I had a fairly decent reading week. So I did read 4 books this week. 3 of them were by W. Somerset Maugham, and the 4th was by J.M. Barrie. So I'm going to start with the W. Somerset Maugham, kind of going in chronological order rather, describing the books that I read first and ending with the J.M. Barrie, which I finished today. So earlier this week I read the novel Then and Now, which is an historical fiction novel set in the 1500s, and it takes an interesting approach to the life of Machiavelli. So Machiavelli is our main character here, but he is supported by a young 18-year-old man by the name of Piero, who accompanies him on a diplomatic mission. They go from Florence, where they are both from, to see Duke Caesar Borgia, who is with his army kind of terrorizing a good part of Italy. And Florence would like to, sign a peace treaty with him, or at least make an alliance of some sort, as they fear that they may be next on the invasion list, so to speak. But Machiavelli is sent off rather reluctantly with no real powers to negotiate. He is essentially given only the power to send back messages by, messenger, which would take several days, and to convey the messages that return from Florence to the Duke. And so you'd think this would be mostly a novel about that diplomacy, about the diplomatic relations between the two city-states here, but that is not really what this novel is about, oddly enough. Instead, it ends up being largely about Machiavelli attempting to seduce the wife of a man that he meets while he is on this mission. So while I did enjoy this novel, I think, the major criticism I had of it is an issue that I often have with a lot of historical fiction. So much happened, off screen, so to speak, and a good part of the text was also kind of an information dump. Like this happened over here, and this happened prior to that, and this is the situation here. And as I was reading, I was like, I don't really care exactly the situation we're in. I don't really care that this happened, over here off screen. That's all good and nice, but how about showing me something interesting on screen, so to speak? And I think maybe that's just my problem with historical fiction in general. The detailed explanation of climate, of events. I'm just not into that, and I know a lot of people are, and a lot of people have said that this particular novel is one of the best examples of historical fiction that they've ever read. But for me, it was just kind of meh. I'll leave it at that. It was all right, but it's not something I would praise effusively. So it was my least favorite read of the week, but I decided to follow that up with another novel that I enjoyed much more, which is Cakes and Ale, also by W. Somerset Maugham. And this was by far my favorite read of the week. So our main character is a writer, a rather mediocre writer, who is surprised when he gets a message from his old friend, Alroy Keir, asking him to get in touch with him immediately and asking him to lunch. He is surprised because Keir is a much more successful writer than he is, and Keir dropped him several years back when he became successful and famous, because our main character, he was just not in the same social setting anymore. And so Keir gets in touch with him, and our main character is very curious as to why. And then Keir begins to ask him questions about what he knew of the recently deceased author, Dreffield. And our main character begins to remember and to reminisce about his childhood, about his days as a young man when he knew Dreffield and Dreffield's first wife, Rosie. And that, it's just very interesting to read about one author reminiscing about another, especially through the lens of childhood, and knowing that there are many people in the present state who have a very idealized version in their heads of who this person was, of who Dreffield was. And so, as his friend Keir is setting out to write this biography, that's why he's called his friend there. Keir wants to write a biography, and so he wants to get the goods, so to speak, and any correspondence our main character may have. As Keir sets out to write this biography, with the blessing and the urging of Dreffield's second wife, I'll just call her Mrs. Dreffield here, the widow, as he sets out to write this, he is doing it, through a rose-colored glass lens, almost. He is writing this in, an idealized, sanitized way, as biographies often are written. But we have our main character remembering what really was and remembering things that Keir and the widow certainly won't want in this official biography. But I thoroughly enjoyed this novel. And so then I decided to follow that one up with a third W. Somerset Maugham novel called Christmas Holiday. And I think this one is rather inappropriately named. Not because it doesn't take place over Christmas, but because it's not a very cheery novel, and Christmas really has very little to do with the plot of the novel. So this is about a young, wealthy, semi-wealthy man by the name of Charlie, who sets off to Paris for a week. It is, a present from his father because he has wisely, according to Charlie, given up his dreams of becoming an artist because he could only ever be a second-rate artist, and has settled down after going to Cambridge into the family business, following in his father's footsteps. And so in, kind of repayment, as a reward for being such a good son, his father is sending him to Paris for a week. And he intends to spend his entire time there with his old school friend, Simon, who is pursuing the impoverished life of a reporter in Paris. But when he arrives, he finds Simon very much changed, very jaded, and almost, as I would describe the passage I read, Simon seems to be trying to make himself into a sociopath. He wants to set himself apart from all other human beings and make himself feel nothing and be entirely reliant on himself. He is in fact trying to distance himself from Charlie, who Simon describes as the only one he ever really cared about. But he does, some cruel things to kind of break his feelings for his friend. And we find out that Simon is even seeing himself as, the potential right-hand man to a dictator at some point, which is a little bit chilling considering this novel was published in 1939. So you get the sense that Simon could definitely have become a supporter of a fascist regime, but so Charlie shows up there thinking he's going to have a good time, but instead he becomes entangled with Simon's personal issues and also with a young woman by the name of Lydia, who he meets. Lydia has, fled her native country of Russia, and she did so at the age of 2, so she really has no connection to that Russian way of life there, but she also feels disconnected from the Parisian and the French way of life. So she has that combined with the tragic events of her own marriage and her husband's imprisonment to deal with. And so instead of having a delightful holiday and seeing the pictures in the Louvre and, sleeping with several women as he intended and spending a lot of time with his friend Simon, he is sort of abandoned by Simon and finds himself spending his week there with this impoverished woman, Lydia, listening to her sorrows. And it, of course, has a profound effect on him. And it's curious to think, the novel kind of leaves him where he started, but it's curious to think how these experiences perhaps have an effect on him later in life when he is able to process more. So I read that one and liked it. And then I decided to dive into When a Man's Single by J.M. Barrie, which I hauled earlier this week. And I really enjoyed this one as well. I started it last night and finished it today. And while I liked it, it did have a bit of a rocky start. And I think that's mainly because it was published in a serial format. And so perhaps J.M. Barrie didn't really know where he was going until he got a little ways in. And the short introduction provided by J.M. Barrie, I think, supports that. He does say that he was writing as he went, and that perhaps the title he'd selected wasn't appropriate, as our main character, Rob Angus, did meet a love interest pretty early on in the novel. In kind of a strange way, the opening chapters are very, very different from the rest of the novel. The opening chapter is set in a small Scottish town, and we meet 4-year-old Davy, who wanders off and drowns. And we discover that she is the niece of Rob Angus, who is looking after her, and he is fairly devastated. But not long after, he goes off to the city to earn his living as a journalist. And so the bulk of the novel is about being a journalist in this small city, but also eventually in London, where Rob Angus heads to after a little bit, getting a little bit established. But even as I finished the novel, I'm wondering what purpose that opening chapter served, apart from providing a bunch of Scottish dialogue and providing a tragic scene. Because Rob Angus never really brings it up again in a meaningful way, and we don't really see what effect it has on his behavior. If anything, I think the only purpose here is to predispose the reader to be sympathetic towards Rob Angus and perhaps some of his slightly absurd and insane actions. We have things like him meeting a particular young woman, his love interest, and despite only having shared a few words with her the night before, staying up all night long to reread her novel and then setting out first thing in the morning with no sleep to find her again, and then chickening out, so to speak, and instead of speaking to her, lurking behind hedges and stalking her down the street for what I would imagine to be at least, a half hour, maybe more, possibly several hours. And then, having little to say to her when she finally notices him and speaks to him. And then, he rather impulsively at one point, after impulsively stating to her that he's going to London to become a more famous journalist, he rather impulsively jumps on a train to London with no prior planning and no ticket, without bringing his luggage along, without letting his landlady know that he's leaving. And he does, these absurd actions that perhaps we can only justify knowing that tragic backstory. But it's a little bit disjointed between that first chapter, that tragic backstory, and the rest of the novel, which is quite humorous. It's one of those novels that tells you a lot, I think, about the state of journalism at the time that it was published, and there's really some rather relevant bits in here. For instance, a fellow journalist, Simon, can make a story out of anything. And so Rob Angus remarks about his walking stick that a doctor once told him not to hold on to it so tightly as he'll get a disease of the hand, which will affect his nervous system or something. And Simon writes a quick article about this disease, about what can happen, and quickly people start picking up on this trend, talking about this mysterious disease you can get from holding a walking stick too tight, to the point where other journalists are copying this, saying that it was someone else, a friend they knew, who had told them this story, or it was a politician who had suffered from this, or it was a neighbor of theirs who had suffered from this. And so we see the way that, false news stories can replicate, and how things that aren't true get spread very quickly, but also, the jaded world of being a journalist. And there's some passages in here, my voice is starting to give out, so I won't take the trouble of finding them and reading them to you, but as I was, looking up some more about this online, I found a couple of people saying, this is the novel that taught me how to be a journalist, because there is what seems like some very sound advice in here about choosing the topic for newspaper articles, and about, what to write about, what not to write about, and how to approach being a journalist. And it just takes you, this novel, into that whole interesting world of journalism in a very humorous way, which I think is why I enjoyed it so much. The awkward love story notwithstanding. So that is what I've read this week, and I started a 5th novel on the bus today. This is one that I saw someone do a long video about a couple months back, and for the life of me I can't remember who, but it piqued my interest enough that when I saw it at Black Squirrel Books on the weekend, I decided that I needed to pick this one up. And it is a non-fiction work called Romantic Outlaws, The Extraordinary Lives of Mary Wollstonecraft and Mary Shelley. And this is by Charlotte Gordon. And so it is essentially about the lives of these two women, mother and daughter, and about the influence that Wollstonecraft had on her daughter Mary Shelley, despite the fact that Wollstonecraft died 10 days after the birth of Mary Shelley due to complications of childbirth. And so I'm looking very much forward to diving farther into this. As you can see, I'm only a few pages in, but this should be a good one. So let me know if you've read any of these and what you think of them, and also let me know in the comments below what you plan to read this weekend. I hope you have a lovely reading weekend.